Deathblade here with another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ. This topic is brought to you by patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to support the channel and vote on the topics for the videos, you can find the link in the description below. So today I'm talking about sect forms of address, and that's actually kind of not really the most accurate title for the video because it's not just the sect. Sect is just one word that's used to describe one of the many different types of organizations that appear in Wuxia, Xianxia, and Xianxia novels, the Chinese fantasy novels. And I'm talking about that. Essentially, forms of address for organizations that are outside of the clan or family structure. Now I have a whole video, one of my very first videos, where I talked about the difference between the sect and the clan. That video is right here. And I actually probably ought to update that video because I think there's a little bit more complexity than I touch on in that video. But in any case, today I'm talking about the different ways that people address each other in these organizations that are not family-based. Now, again, I have a video about the family-based forms of address. I'll link that as well. Let's get into the topic of these non-family, non-clan forms of address. Now, there are actually a lot of different ways that people can address each other, probably too many to list out, and especially that is the case when you consider that you can invent forms of address. Invented forms of address are a common thing in the fantasy novels. I think that's the same whether you're talking about English or Chinese or any other language. I mean, it is fantasy, so it's not reality, and the authors can use titles however they want, and they can make up new titles whenever they want as well. However, there is one specific system of address that's very, very common. You see it, I would say, in probably all of the fantasy novels, whether it's Wuxia, Xianxia, or whatever. It's based on real life as well. And most of them involve combining the character shi, which I'll put on the screen here really quickly, with a variety of other characters to create different forms of address for different people. The most common ones are going to be shifu, shimu, shixiong, shidi, shijie, shimei, and there's many other ones as well. I'm going to go through really quickly and break down that group that I just mentioned before talking about some of the variants and then getting into other forms of address. So shifu, there are actually two different versions of shifu. One of them has the character for father, the other has the character for a character that I guess you could say means teacher or has other meanings as well. They're both kind of used, I've seen them used synonymously in the novels. You know, in these videos, I always get people that jump in that are like Chinese language learners or even native Chinese speakers that'll call me on this. Like, that's not correct. It's not used that way. Look, I've translated millions of Chinese characters of fiction, and I can tell you whether it's unintentional on the part of the author, whether it's a typo, whether they're uninformed or whatever it is, I can tell you that these two different versions of shifu are used interchangeably. I have definitely seen it done that way before. There are different ways to translate it. I personally translate it as master. I think most people translate it as master. Sometimes it gets transliterated. I remember when I was first getting into wuxia movies, a lot of them came from Hong Kong, and so you'll see it transliterated as sifu. Way early on, I even wrote some of my own wuxia short stories, and I would have the characters calling their master sifu, because that's what you see in the movies, but it's basically shifu in Mandarin, and it means master. I have seen it transliterated as shifu even in some modern translations, professional licensed translations, which I'm not going to name here. I think it's really silly to transliterate it as shifu. It just means master. It's what you call your teacher or your master. There are, of course, different ways to translate it that would be acceptable, but again, master is the most common one. And then you have shimu. Mu is the character for mother. So these are what the disciples or the apprentices or the lower level members of the organization will refer to the wife of the master as. Then you have shixiong and shidi. Now, xiong and di are essentially the words for brother, one of them being older brother, one of them being younger brother. And when you combine it with the shi, what this basically means is a older or younger male fellow apprentice or disciple of some organization. The complementary ones are shijie and shimei, which is the older sister and younger sister. So again, a form of address for a fellow female disciple or apprentice of some sort in some organization in which learning is involved. And so in the novels and in the movies, you will always hear the characters who are the disciples of the sect, and that usually includes the main character, but not always, will be addressing each other with this shidi, shixiong, shimei, this kind of thing. As for how to translate these shixiong, shimei kind of things, there obviously is a bit of variety in how you could choose to translate it. I personally go with elder brother and junior brother, elder sister, junior sister. Now there could be some argument to use senior instead of elder. That's fine. I don't necessarily claim to have the perfect system. That's just what I came up with a long time ago, and I've kind of stuck with it. There are other common words that are used to describe the various generations of people within an organization, and there's another common but different word that's referring to the older people. And for that, I use senior as opposed to elder. So that's why I don't want to have the senior brother and junior brother. I'd rather have elder brother and junior brother. But again, it's not perfect. I think what's important in a given novel is that there's consistency. I would love for there to be consistency among all novels to make it easier for readers to understand. I've mentioned this before, but obviously that's not possible. I mean, even in my own translations, it's hard to maintain consistency, and sometimes I'll change how a form of address is translated from novel to novel. I usually don't do that within a novel. If I do, and it's an active translation, I'll let the readers know so that they aren't confused by it. And then you have the practice of adding a number before these different titles. So you'll have 二师兄, which is the second elder brother, or the, 八师妹, the 8th junior sister, where basically they're just listing out the ranking overall, and that's how they'll address each other as. Now sadly, in the subtitles and the dubbing of movies and animations and whatever, I think that this often gets lost. They'll sometimes just change it to third brother or fourth sister or something, as opposed to translating out the full meaning. The full meaning can be important because it really emphasizes the ranking system, and so this is something probably you're not going to see if you're mostly a fan of visual media. I think that it will get translated more accurately in novels most of the time, depending on how the translator handles it. There's another factor that plays into it, and that is what type of organization it is, because you can do things other than the brother and sister. You can add in uncle, aunt, or grandfather, or a whole bunch of different things to the shi. So you could have shishu, you could have shizu, all these different things. And in that case, it doesn't make sense to just use elder and junior, or senior and junior, whatever the translator chooses. It needs to be something more specific. And in that case, what I personally will do is I'll just change it depending on what type of organization it is. So for example, if it's called the Dragon Sect, then I will translate that as the sect uncle or the sect grandfather. But if it's not a sect, if it's something else, like it's a house or it's a hall or it's something else, then I might change it to be something else. Like for example, let's say it's the House of Flying Daggers, I might have it be house uncle or house grandfather to make all of those different connections depending on what kind of organization it is. That's personally my way of doing it. I know that other translators handle it in different ways. If you're a translator or a reader who have noticed it used in different ways, please feel free to leave a note in the comment section. I'd love to hear about that. And finally, I want to point out that, as I mentioned earlier in the video, there are a lot of different invented forms of address, or even if they're not invented, they're not necessarily common and they don't fall into that really common way of referring to each other. The shidi, shixiong thing is even something that is used in modern times, and even shifu is actually turned into a really common way to just address a male that's older than you, that you don't know. Even cab drivers, that's what I'll call a cab driver when I'm in China. It does vary from location to location within China, and of course that doesn't count for all Chinese-speaking countries in the world. But anyway, I got myself derailed again. The point is that in terms of other forms of address, there can be just so many that it's impossible to cover them all in one video or even a book. There's actually a book, a pretty common book that's used by translators, where it's talking about different titles that are used in government positions, and that is probably another topic for another video. But the point is just the sheer number of them makes it impossible to really go into detail about every single one. One thing about the Chinese language is that even though there are a limited number of characters, usually about 5,000 to 6,000 that are commonly seen in literature, maybe a little bit more than that depending on how complex and old the literature is. Even though there's only 5,000 characters, those characters can be put together in an astonishing number of variations to create all kinds of different new words that make sense to a Chinese reader instantly, but you will never find in any dictionary. I hope this video was helpful. Again, it's a pretty complicated topic that I don't want to talk about for an hour because I know that would be pretty boring. I hope this helps to understand how people address each other outside of the family situation. If you have any questions, please do leave them in the comment section below. I try to get back to as many questions as I can, and that's it for this video. See you next time. Godsala.